I hated therapy. It never helped me to talk about my feelings. It was a waste of my time and it was always the same shit. I would tell them about my life, and they would have some pained look of pity on their faces. I often wondered if that was real or part of their job to pretend like they actually care.
Good morning, Jesham.
A middle-aged white lady said. She smiled brightly. She seemed way too happy to be here. I could see her huge coffee mug sitting on her desk. The part where she drank out was stained. She hated this. Caffeine was just her legal drug of choice to get her through the day. Since she seemed to hate this, maybe we could cut through the shit and I could leave. I sat down in the chair in front of her. Her office was very tidy. She either had OCD or the cleaners she hired were very good. I nodded at her. I don't need therapy, I said right out of the gate. The therapist smiled.
We all need therapy. Just think of me as a friend.
She responded. I sighed deeply. I wondered if that response was in the therapist handbook. They all seemed to have the same answer. Well, you're not my friend and I don't need any friends. I court-ordered to be here. I'm sure you have better things to do with your time, I replied. The smile never left her pudgy face. It seemed almost like it was pasted on. She took a deep breath as if contemplating how to respond. I knew she didn't want to be here either, but unlike me, she was getting paid to listen to my dribble on about my life.
You're right, I do have better things to do. But since we are both here, let's make the best of this hour. Okay, if you don't want to see me again, I'll gladly suggest another therapist for you.
The therapist responded. I was shocked that she could say all of that, and that fake smile never left her face. She essentially gave me a polite,
well, fuck you too.
But she had a point. It was only an hour out of the day. After that, I could go back home to my wife and 6 annoying kids. I sighed. So where do we start? I asked. The therapist skimmed through my file and then looked up at me.
Seems a lot of your trauma comes from your mother. Would you like to tell me about her?
She asked. I didn't really want to discuss my mother. She died in 2020. As far as she was concerned, that was a chapter in my life that came to a happy ending. But hell, talking about her would make this hour go by quickly. The therapist watched me intently as I struggled with the idea of talking about my mother. Ever since she had died, I had forgotten about her. She was my monster under my bed, so to speak. Knowing that she was dead was a relief to me. I don't know why these therapists insisted on reopening scars. I sighed deeply and began at the beginning.
I remember getting off of the plane and taking my first step on American soil. I remember taking my first breath of American air. I was excited and eager to start my life in America. I could not wait to start school and be something I could not be in Egypt. This was a place where dreams could come true. I was a 17-year-old Egyptian girl out on my own for the first time in my life. I had a couple $1,000s that my father gave me. I remember him hugging me and crying as he clutched me to his brown chest. I nestled my face into his shoulder and wept. My father was my rock. He was my place of comfort and source of strength. I had never seen him cry until that day. It broke my heart to see the man I adored cry. I almost could not board that plane. Please be safe, daughter. This world is filled with monsters who hide behind smiles, my father said. I never really put stock in his words, not until I got much older. How could I? I was still a kid who had been sheltered my entire life. I had been protected by my father. His loving arms had always been around me. Now, for the first time, I would be beyond his reach. As I got off the plane and walked out of the terminal, there was a man from my country holding up a sign with my name on it. My father had arranged for me to stay in a boarding house of some sort. It was all women from my country who came to America for a better education and life. We all had lofty dreams and goals. Our school was paid for by our country. The goal was to get an education in America, then go back home and be an asset to our country. I waved at the man and smiled at him. "Daughter of Mahmoud?" the man asked. His accent was so thick it was hard to understand his English. I knew he would not publicly speak Arabic to me. It was against the rules for us to speak Arabic in public. We needed to learn English and sound as native to this country as we could, so we were encouraged to always speak English. I nodded at him and smiled. He reminded me of one of my old uncles back home. He was tall, thin, and looked like an elder teenager, if that makes sense. "I am," I replied. He smiled and motioned for me to follow. The American airport was busy. It was crowded. People were traveling and going all over the world. I wondered what it would be like to be one of them. To have a destination to go to and explore it without a care in the world. This was my start on that path. I would get my education, make my father proud, and travel all over the world. I wanted to take my father to places I knew he wanted to go but could not afford. My father worked day and night to give me and my siblings a life that most in Egypt could not get. He worked extra to save up $2,000 to give me. I started to cry as I followed this man out of the busy airport and to the old black sedan that he had. He had cleared me with customs and immigration early. Egypt and many other countries paid the U.S. tons of money to be able to send students to America to learn. America was more than happy to take the money and push us through their immigration process. I turned and looked at the airport one last time as the man held the door open for me. Something told me not to get into that car. I'm not sure if it was the smile on that man's face or just some strange premonition of what was to come. As I sat in the car and the door closed, I felt like I was leaving my innocence behind. I could see myself still standing at the terminal, waving down to the me who was in the car leaving. My heart raced as the car sped away from the airport. Suddenly, I did not feel as safe and secure as I did in the airport. I guess the airport was the last remnants of my father's arms wrapped around me. They seemed they could not stretch any further. I was in a city called Phoenix. It was hot here. The weather was much like that in Egypt. Hot and sandy during the day, but cold at night. I don't think it ever was truly cold, just that the people here were so used to it being so hot that when it dropped down to the 80s and 70s, it seemed freezing. The city was beautiful. It was so much different than it was in Egypt. The streets looked clean and maintained. Men and women walked freely together. Everyone intermingled. There was no religious law here. It seemed loose and relaxed. Women jogged through parks in what looked like thin underwear. It was later that I understood that it was the Western version of a bathing suit. This was a strange new world for me. I was eager to get a job and maybe find a good Muslim husband here. I wanted to help my country. I felt I could help it better if I was first an American citizen. After about an hour of driving, we pulled into a driveway. The house was huge. It was much bigger than anything in my neighborhood in Egypt. My father was not rich. Our home was modest, but it was warm and filled with love. That's all I truly needed. Warmth and love. My father set the standard high. The driveway was long, and the house looked like a normal house. One would never know that several young foreign women stayed here, that we were striving for a better education to in turn help advance our country. As I got out of the car, I noticed a dark-skinned man standing by the door. He was giving one of the Egyptian men who were here to look after us and protect us a bunch of money. They smiled, laughed, and shook hands. The dark-skinned man turned and was beginning to walk down the driveway. He stopped to look me over. "Damn, baby," the dark-skinned man said. I felt uneasy. He stared at me like I was a piece of meat. He was a rabid, hungry dog ready to devour me. I studied him. He was very handsome. He dressed nicely and walked with an air of authority. He seemed dangerous, like a shark who smelt blood in the water. His eyes were as dark as his flesh, but they seemed evil. I have never experienced a man like him before. It was like looking into the eyes of a soldier that has seen far too much death. They were cold and emotionless. It seemed he could kill me just as easily as he could help me. Was this America? Were the people here this cold and detached from their humanity? I did not say anything to him. I looked down and hurried past him. My father told me not to look men in the eyes. Some men would take that as me being interested in them, or of being sexually immoral. I wanted nothing to do with a man such as that dark-skinned man. The dark-skinned man pointed at me as I approached the door where a man from my country stood. The Egyptian man smiled and nodded. It communicated something that I was not aware of. Whatever it was, it involved me. I expected the men from my country to protect us. Most of these men were ex-Egyptian soldiers or police. They were on our country's payroll to protect us while we were here. For some reason, I did not feel so protected. I thought about getting back into the car and asking to be driven back to the airport. But I knew my father risked so much for me to be here. He had worked so hard to save the money for me to be in this program, have a life that was better than his. I missed my father already. I felt cold outside of his home and arms. Out of all the men in the world, I knew he was the only one I could trust with anything. He did not look at me as a sex object. In his eyes, I was the baby he held as my mother pushed me out. I would always be that baby in his loving eyes. I have yet to see that same love for me in the eyes of any other man. Maybe I was a naive fool to think that anyone would ever love me the way my father does. The Egyptian man opened the door for me and invited me into the house. Immediately, I felt like I was in a prison, that I stepped into a cage that I could not escape from. I was afraid. The house was big on the inside. It was decked out in traditional Egyptian decorations to make the girls feel more at home. It smelt of thick Egyptian incense. I was led to a back room. There were several girls in this room. 3 sets of bunk beds were placed in here. Surprisingly, this room was very spacious. I was given a bunk on the top, and my bed was by the bathroom door. I looked at the other women in this room. They looked tired, and some had bruises on their faces. They were in what looked like their underwear. They did not try to cover their bodies as a man opened the door and let me in. He stared at them a long moment and smiled.
It can be scary at first.
A woman that was slightly older than me said. She had a black eye. It looked like someone recently savagely beat her. She caught me staring at her eye. She turned away and placed my suitcase on the top bunk.
It's sad what happened to the girl who used to sleep there.
An older woman said. She wore pink panties and a bra. She laid on her stomach, flipping through a magazine. I did not understand why these women were dressed this way. Did they not care for modesty? I acted like I didn't hear her.
She is new. Give her a couple of days before you crush her dreams,
the woman with the black eye said. The older woman glared at her.
I am trying to help her. Look at her. She is innocent and probably thinks she was sent here for school. I'm tired of seeing girls being sent here and beat to death like Ashma for not wanting to be a hoe,
the older woman said. My face paled. I was not sent here for school. A girl died? I turned around to face them and demand to know what was going on, but the older woman grabbed my arms and twisted them behind my back. She held me down on the bed. One of the other girls put her hand over my mouth to muffle my screams. The woman with the black eye leaned down and whispered in my ear.
We are trying to help you. You can't go through this sober, and we can't watch another young girl from our country die,
she whispered in my ear. I saw a woman with a needle in her hand approach me. I did not know what was in it. I just knew I did not want it.
Don't put it in her arm. Tamak does not want her to have visible tracks,
the older woman said. She held me down. Another girl rubbed my cheek and kissed me on my forehead.
This will take all your pain away, girl,
the older woman said. I felt something sting in my leg. I screamed into the hands of the woman who was trying to silence me.
We are just trying to help you. This stuff will take you to the sky,
the older woman said. I cried and screamed for a moment more. Then it hit me. It felt like a wave of heat was beating against my flesh. My head spun and I sighed deeply. I thought of my father. I was running in the garden to him. His handsome smile was my world.
That's it. She's in the sky now,
the old woman said. My heart was racing. My head was pounding and my mouth was incredibly dry. I was awake, but I did not open my eyes yet. I had to take a moment to understand what had happened. The last thing I remember was being held down on a bed screaming. I remember being injected with something. I was in a bed on my back. I tried to lift my arm to wipe my mouth, but I couldn't. I had been drooling a lot and it had crusted all over my mouth. I opened my eyes to see that I was naked. My hands and feet were strapped to the bed. I looked around and there were many women around my age in the same situation I was in. There were IVs in our arms and someone was walking around injecting us with something. My vision was blurry. I wanted to scream, but my head hurt too much. Looking around made me dizzy. I turned to the side and vomited.
Fuck,
I heard a man grunt. He walked over to me and started to clean up my vomit. He was a man from my country. I could tell by the way he looked. Why would he do this to me? Did he not have any self-respect or honor? Our country was supposed to come first, before all else.
You're awake?
The man asked. He stared at my naked body for a moment, then roughly spread my legs apart and stuck his fingers in me. I screamed, and my head felt like it was going to explode.
That is right, bitch. In a few days, you will be dead or a zombie. Pleasing men for money.
The man laughed. He roughly shoved his fingers in and out of me. I was a virgin. I had never been with a man. I was saving myself for my husband. It was a virtuous thing to give your virginity to the man that would protect you, love you, and provide for you in your father's place. I hoped I would die. My head spun so much that I blacked out.
Fuck. This one dead.
A man said. I turned my head to see two men unstrapping a young woman and hauling her out of the room. We were not people to them. We were bits of flesh whose only use was to please men. They did not care that I had dreams, that I could cook, and that I had a big heart. They would laugh if they knew I loved to read, that I wanted to one day be a wife and, God willing, a mother. All that mattered to them was that I had a vagina. How could these men of my country do this to their own people? These honored warriors of Egypt. I could not understand how they could betray us so. My head spun as the men came back into the room. It seemed another woman died. They were hauling her body away as well. I felt a sharp slap across my face. I looked up and saw a familiar face. It was the face of the dark-skinned man I saw as I got out of the car. He smiled down at me. He pinched one of my nipples hard. I moaned in pain.
Damn, baby.
The man said. He started to unbuckle his pants.
Yo, give this bitch another dose.
He ordered my countrymen. They laughed and came over with a needle in their hand. The Egyptian leaned down and shot something into my IV. I instantly felt it. My body felt weak and numb. The dark-skinned man's face seemed to fade in and out of view. I saw as if I was in a drum that was being beat loudly. As the drum beat, my vision would shatter, then come back again.
I want you all to get a turn after I'm done, alright?
The dark-skinned man said.
Thank you, Timak.
One of the Egyptian men said, smiling.
And don't take it easy on this bitch. Be rough with her. She got to rip a bit.
T-Mac said. The Egyptian men smiled and high-fived each other. I felt T-Mac's hands force my legs open. They couldn't open very far, being that my ankles were strapped to the bed. He forced them open wide enough. I watched in horror as he pulled his manhood out and spit on it. I could not move. My entire body tingled, but as blurry as my vision was, I could still see everything. He placed himself inside of me and thrust hard. I could not feel anything. My body jerked every time he thrust. He reached down and roughly grabbed my chin.
Nah, bitch. You're gonna watch this.
T-Mac said. He held my chin firm, so I was forced to look into his eyes as he thrust into me again and again. I'm not sure when I blacked out, but I woke to the screams of other women. I turned to see T-Mac raping them as well. This is how it went for days. They would drug me and rape me. I lost track of time. I was so lost in the drugs. They would intentionally not give me the drugs for a day and laugh as I vomited and begged them for it. I would open my legs and beg them to fuck me just so I could have another hit of whatever they gave. Those drugs kept the pain away. It was a strange light in the darkness that became my life. It kept the monsters in my shattered mind at bay. I could not believe I was here. I was once a virgin girl who loved her father. Now I'm begging men to rape me for drugs. They had me. They had broken me. I don't know how long I was in that room or how long they drugged me up. After several more days, they let me out and back in the room I started in with the women that tied me down.
You made it.
One of the women said. They all seemed relieved to see me alive. It seemed that most girls did not make it out of that stage. One of the women helped me to the bathroom. I was still out of it. I could barely walk. She turned on the shower water and gently sat me down on the shower floor. I could not feel the water hit me. I was not sure if it was too hot or too cold.
Don't look up. You might drown.
The woman said. I was surprised she was still in the room. I had thought she had left a long time ago. They spread my legs apart. I did not care what they did to my body. I did not fight or resist.
We are not gonna hurt you, Sky,
the woman said. I watched her face pale as she washed between my legs. Blood flowed from me and into the drain. I looked down and laughed. I was badly bruised and torn. I could not feel anything. I was going to black out. I could feel it coming. The woman called for the others. I wished my father was here.
Abi and Yaan,
I whispered. I was not aware that I was speaking Arabic, that I was asking my father where he was. I was not sure if it was the drugs or the trauma, but I swear I saw him smiling at me. His handsome face appeared out of nowhere.
Ahibbuk Habibati,
I heard him say. I could not help but weep. He had told me he loved me, that I was his beloved. Oh, I missed my father. I never should have left. I should have listened to my mother and stayed in Egypt, stayed in my father's home and in his protective arms.
she is crying for her father,
one of the Egyptian women said. I could hear the pain in her voice, could see the pain in the eyes of the other women from my country. I wondered if they had been here, bloody, raped, and drugged, crying out for their father as they wept in the shower. I figured they had. That they had tried hard to push down any memory of who and what they were before T-Mac. Seeing me here like this brought their memories back in a flood. I saw one of the girls sit down and clutch her head. She started to hum a song. It was one I recognized. The other women from my country hummed it as well. It was a song that Egyptian mothers would hum to their kids when they were fussy or got hurt. It was a song about the love of Allah and how all things heal and pass over time. The women wept and hugged me. We were a family. We were all we had. There was an unspoken bond between us to look after one another. I was helped out of the shower with a clean white towel wrapped around me. It quickly became stained with blood. The women were kind and helped me put on a pad that women use after pregnancy. It was to catch the blood of women who were swollen and bruised. I was badly torn. If I did not stop bleeding, I would die. Maybe death was better for me. They helped put a long nightshirt on me and some loose panties. They had several towels on my bunk and helped me up to it. I laid there for several days. The women would feed me hot soup and give me a hit of the crack that I had been forcibly addicted to. The women would come and go. They would talk about their day on the corner and how much money they made. They were sending tons of money back to their families. It seemed T-Mac was brutal, but he liked to keep his whores and all that worked for him happy. I guess it was smart business. After you broke someone down and strung them out, you go out of your way to make them think you are some gracious protector of theirs, instead of the monster who trafficked girls. As the days passed, I knew it would not be long until I was expected to be out on the corner. The audacity of T-Mac was he felt we owed him for all the terror he put us through. That we should be thankful that he raped us and turned us into streetwalkers. His arrogance made him believe that he was doing us a favor. I guess that was how he rationalized his action. How else could he live with himself? Or maybe he just didn't care. The pain eventually started to lessen. It would not completely go away for months to come. I was banned from having sex until I was healed, but I could service a man with my mouth. I had never done this before. T-Mac had the other women teach me. He would have one of the Egyptian men come in the room, and all the women would take turns showing me. The trick was to make him climax as soon as possible. For T-Mac, our time was money. The less time it took us to service one client, the quicker we could get to the next and make more money. The clients did not care how long it took. They just wanted to come. The women were right. I could not be sober for this. I found myself taking more and more of the drug. I would wake up in the morning and take a hit for breakfast. Others took coffee. I took crack. If I was going to be sucking some random men's dirty cocks, I needed to be high. I needed to be lost in the sky. The moniker that gave me was because of my fast addiction to crack. I needed it now more than I needed to eat. I could not live now without being high, without my mind gone in the sky while my body pleased men for money. I don't blame the men that paid for my services. They're like most people who see a service they want and thus pay for it. They had no idea what I had to endure. Most like to remain clueless and ignorant about this business. They like to think this is something we chose to do instead of it being forced upon us. I guess I'm still naive in the fact that I like to think that most men are good. If they knew I was forced into this life, that they would help me instead of pay to use my body.
Sky, you ready?
One of the women asked.
Ready for what?
I replied. The woman looked at me confused, like she could not understand how I did not know where I was about to go.
It is time to start paying Tumak back and get on the corner,
she said. My first week on the corner was not as bad as I thought it would have been. I was constantly high, so I don't remember most of it anyway. It was all a blur. I would wake 1 minute in some man's car, then blink and I'd suddenly be back in my bed, sweating and shaking from all the drugs in my system. I was not sure if I was doing a good job or not. Honestly, I did not care. As long as I stayed high. I knew I could not do this sober. All the men seemed the same. Black or white, they all were dirty pigs to me. They all smelled of smoke and shit. They all tasted horrible. I think I started to lose my mind then. I would see my father frowning at me. I found myself talking to my father as I waited on the corner with the other girls from my country. They would look at me concerned and I would smile at them. When I tried to sleep, I could hear my father weeping for me. The drugs had me so gone that I don't remember the years passing, nor do I remember being pregnant and having my first child. She was half white. I was surprised T-Mac didn't kill her. I named her Maya. My father was there as I gave birth to her. Only I could see him, but he was there. He held my hand as I pushed out his granddaughter. He laughed and told me how beautiful she was. Then we would argue when he asked me who the father was. I would get angry because he seemed to forget that I was a streetwalker now, and that I did not know who the father was. T-Mac didn't take me to a hospital. He had his own doctor on his payroll. She seemed just as strung out as me. I noticed T-Mac didn't have too many men in his employ. I wondered if that was because he was a coward, that he knew he could not control a man as he could a woman. I was back on the corner shortly after I had Maya. T-Mac didn't let me heal. When I asked him if I could have more time, he laughed.
Your mouth works just fine,
he replied. I doubled up on my drugs just so I could deal with the pain. I was bleeding still. Maya was my first child and she really ripped me. I became a walking zombie. I was a corpse who was pretending to be alive. Every now and then I would have a dream of laying in my bed in my father's house. I knew it was time to get up for school. I could hear my father calling me.
Aisha.
His soft voice called. I hid in my bed and pretended to be asleep. It would take all that I had to hold in my laughter as he got closer.
Where is my Aisha?
my father said. My heart raced and small snickers would escape my tightly clenched lips. He would walk around the room and check the closet and under the bed. I could never hold in my laughter for long. Normally, by the time he checked under the bed, I was crying with laughter.
Ah, there she is,
my father said, a big, loving smile on his handsome face. He would hug me and tickle me. Oh, I missed my father,
Sky,
I heard someone say. They were shaking me.
Sky.
They said it again as they shook me. For a moment, I didn't recognize the name. Then it hit me. Alicia is dead. That innocent girl who loved and adored her father died when she walked out of that airport. Now all that is left is Sky the zombie. I opened my eyes and frowned. It took everything I had not to cry. I was disappointed that I was alive, that I was in this bed in the wretched hell. The woman shaking me looked at me sadly. They all knew I was barely hanging on. What little mind I had left was quickly fading.
You have a visitor,
the woman said. She smiled at me and patted me on my head. A visitor? I had been here for years and no one had ever gotten a visitor. I slowly got out of bed. I had to move slow. If I didn't, I would get sick and throw up. I had so much drugs in my system, any doctor would be amazed I was still alive. I had more drugs than blood, it seemed. I walked to the bathroom and splashed water on my face.
Tell him to leave, Sky. Tell him to leave and never come back.
One of the girls told me. She had a sad, pleading look on her face.
Him?
I asked. My heart raced. Could it be? Could my father have come to save me from this hell? I wanted to scream and run to him, but I knew I had to slowly walk into the other room. Would he recognize me? This shambling zombie that could barely walk. I knew my face and arms were scarred and scabbed where I had been picking at my flesh. I walked into the other room and saw him sitting on the couch. He stared right at me and did not recognize me. That broke my heart into a million pieces. Of course it was not his fault. I wanted to be his little girl again and run into his arms. He probably worked very hard to save up enough to get a visa to see me.
Abby?
I said. My voice was barely a whisper. My father looked old and tired. He turned to me and stared at me for a long moment, trying to recognize me through the drug-addled monster I had become.
Aisha?
My father asked. I could see the pain in his eyes. He ran to me and hugged me tightly. He wept into my hair as he held me. I could not help but weep as well.
What happened to you? You are coming home now,
my father said. His voice was sad and angry. I was helpless in his arms. I was back in his home trying not to laugh as he pretended to look for me. I could not help it.
Save me, Abby,
I whispered. I knew I should not have said that. I should have told him to leave and never come back. I should have told him his daughter was dead. All that was left was the zombie Sky. My words seemed to light a fire in my father's eyes. He stood and walked me to the door. The Egyptian men that guard the house started to yell at my father. My father yelled back. I was getting dizzy. I've never seen my father this angry. He grabbed a bat that was next to the door and smashed one of the men in the head with it. He kept on hitting him. Blood splattered on my father's face and arms. The other men backed up.
What cruel men are you? How could you betray our people and our culture like this? Allah curse you, traitors!
My father shouted at them in Arabic. I could tell the words stung them, that they hit home and found a sore spot in the men's hearts. They looked down in shame. I think they were going to let me go, but the door opened behind my father. I turned to see T-Mac with a gun to my father's head.
Abby,
I whispered. He locked eyes with me. I think he knew he was dead. He didn't want the last thing he looked at to be that black demon, T-Mac.
La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulallah.
My father said. He smiled at me. His eyes were warm. I was his little girl again. I didn't see T-Mac pull the trigger or hear the gun go off. The side of my father's head exploded, and his body fell limp to the floor.
This is why we don't get fucking visitors.
T-Mac shouted. He looked at the dead man that my father killed and shook his head. It was a waste of money and investment for him.
You're gonna pay for this, bitch.
T-Mac said. He kicked my father's dead body several times, then walked over to me and beat me until I passed out. I blamed myself for my father dying. Why did I have to ask him to save me? What did I expect my father to do? He did what any loving father would do for their child. He tried to save me. He died for me. He could still be alive right now if I had not whispered those words to him. If I had let go of Alicia and my father a long time ago. I wept for weeks after T-Mac murdered my father. Of course, I never wept openly. I held it in until I had a moment alone. As soon as I was alone, I wept hard. I wanted to die. I was relentless on the drugs. I had to erase the look of pain in my father's eyes as he recognized me. I had to stop seeing the smile on his face as he said Shahada. He knew he was going to die. Most of all, I didn't want to see his face explode and his body falling dead at my feet.
Oh, Abby.
I wept. What little mind I had left died with my father. I was so gone that T-Mac took me off the corner. I could barely walk. I was stumbling and falling all over the place. He put me in an apartment with Maya. I was to do in-calls. He wanted to slowly wean me off the drugs, but I needed the drugs or I would die. I would rather be high and feel sick on the drugs than face the memories and the pain of what I had endured. The apartment was nice. Well, anything was when you're used to sharing a dorm with several other women. It was not until many years later that I discovered why my father had come to see me. My mother had died. He wanted me to come home for the funeral. I was alone. I did not know where my siblings were, and I had to forget about them. T-Mac started to see me often in the apartment. He forced himself on me. I had to do my job and please him. It was extremely hard for me to please the man who murdered my father. I could deal with what he had done to me, but my father was my world. T-Mac took the last shred of light I clung to. I dreamt about killing him as he slept next to me. It would take nothing for me to stab him in the throat with one of the many needles around me. But I never could find the courage to. Then, out of nowhere, I was pregnant. I knew whose child it was. T-Mac was the only man I had actual sex with for many months. I didn't want this child. I made up my mind that I would kill it. I took so many drugs trying to overdose and kill the black fetus of T-Mac inside of me. I felt like I was carrying a demon in my womb. When that failed, I would beat my stomach. I tried sticking a coat hanger in me to kill it. Still, this bastard would not die. I promised myself I would kill this child even if I had to give birth to it first. T-Mac's seed would never be safe with me. I found myself strapped to a hospital bed. My stomach was bleeding and scratched from me trying to claw this black bastard out of me. I wept and I screamed. I did not want to have this baby, yet T-Mac was forcing me to have his child. I could see my father sitting in the corner watching me as I cried and strained at the bonds that held me to this bed. He shook his head and turned his back to me. He was ashamed of me.
Oh, Abby.
I wept.
Don't be ashamed of me, please.
I begged my father. Of course, my father was not there, but my mind was so far gone that I saw him there. There was a small part of me that fought to cling to sanity. That small part of me was screaming, trying to remind me that my father was dead and that I was losing my mind. T-Mac would come in the room when I was screaming too much and inject me with something. I don't know what it was, but it calmed me. I felt the same high that I did years ago when the women held me down in that dorm room and injected me with what seemed like the same thing. T-Mac rubbed my stomach.
It's a boy, Sky. I'm having a son.
T-Mac said. He seemed lost in that thought. I wondered what made this son so special. I knew I could not be the only woman he had raped and forced to have his kid.
I'm gonna let you go after this, Sky. Your mind is too far gone, and I need you to take care of our son. I don't want him to grow up in this shit.
T-Mac said. For the first time since I met him, I saw T-Mac as a human being. He was more than just the monster that did this to me, the black demon that murdered my father. He was a human who was afraid for his own seed. Maybe he regretted his life, but I knew I had a weapon against him now. I could never love this child of his, but I could torture and beat this child and make T-Mac watch as his son suffered just as much as he made me suffer. So I would let this black bastard live just so I can see the look of anguish on T-Mac's face as I destroyed his son. T-Mac tried to sell me to an Arab man after I had his son. I remembered T-Mac holding his son that was many shades lighter than him. I knew I would hate that boy forever. He looked so much like T-Mac. I named him Jesse.
This is it, boy. I'm never gonna see you again after this. This is the only way I know how to protect you. I'm never gonna change.
T-Mac whispered into his newborn son's ear. He said several other things to his son, but I could not hear them. He kissed him on his infant forehead and gave him back to me. For a moment, the monster was gone again, and an old and haggard-looking human man stood before me. He seemed helpless as he stared at his son in my arms. I wonder if he thought I was a demoness who would torture his son. If for a moment he thought of me as I had always thought of him, a cruel monster who was hell-bent on destroying me. I was sold like a common black slave with a black baby to an Arab man. The Arab man took me and T-Mac's son to Saudi Arabia. I didn't last there for very long. I spoke the language and understood the culture, but I was clearly Egyptian, and the Arabs there did not like me or the two kids I had in tow. One was black like his father, the other was white like her father. I could not even try to pretend that they had the same father. My son could pass as the Arab's son, but not my daughter. I had 2 kids with this Arab. I eventually came back to America and divorced the Arab. It was not his fault. I was gone mentally, and I was no good to anyone. I could barely take care of myself. The Arab man was a good man. He offered to take Maya and Jesse and raise them as his own with his blood kids. I refused. I would have given him Maya, but Jesse I had to keep. I had dreamed of coming back to America just to beat and torture Jesse. I wanted to get T-Mac's son strung out on drugs and watch as men raped him. I had sold Jesse to white men for a bag of crack. That was all he was worth to me. I would smoke that crack and record these white pedophiles as they beat and raped Jesse. I never saw Jesse when I stared at him. All I saw was T-Mac. As those white men laughed and raped Jesse, I saw them beating and raping T-Mac. I recorded it because I wanted to show T-Mac what I had done to his son that he pretended to love. I wondered how it would make T-Mac feel to see his 5-year-old son being beat near to death and taking it up the ass by white men. Maybe T-Mac would understand a fraction of the pain he put me through. But I was not going to stop there. I wanted to shoot Jesse in the head like I watched T-Mac shoot my father in the head. I wanted to hear T-Mac scream in pain as his flesh and blood died in front of him. I was sure T-Mac would kill me, but I was already more dead than alive anyway. I would die with a smile on my face. But I never got that chance. I never saw T-Mac again after he held Jesse and sold me to that Arab. I knew he was still around, but he avoided me and instructed all his women to leave me alone. I didn't want for anything. Money would be slid under my door in an envelope. It was always over $1,000. My rent was paid and groceries were placed at my door. Jesse and the other kids always had new clothes that were dropped off. All I had to do was stay in the house and be a mother. Many years ago, that would have been an ideal life for me, but not now. My mind was so far gone with the pain and trauma, and I was so obsessed with destroying Jesse that I didn't see how easy I had it. T-Mac was a monster. There's no doubt about that. The only reason he let me go was because he knew he could not raise a kid in the life he had chosen. I guess even a monster cared about his offspring to a certain extent. I became somewhat of a legend among the women of the night, the girls who worked Miracle Mile in Tucson, Arizona. They called my story with T-Mac Beauty and the Beast. They said I was able to tame him. Everyone was told on pain of their life to leave me alone, that I was untouchable, that if anyone touched me or my kids, T-Mac would wipe out their entire families. T-Mac had a reputation on the streets. He was brutal and cold to all who crossed him. Whatever word T-Mac put out, that was the word that would be followed. No one wanted to cross T-Mac. I spoke to many of the women who worked the streets near where I lived. I am certain there are dozens, if not hundreds, of unsolved murders and disappearances tied to T-Mac in some way. He had killed so many women and left their bodies to rot in ditches that I lost count. There were shelters made to protect women from him. He was one of the most wanted sex traffickers in all of the Southwest. Yet he never saw a day in court or got caught for his horrendous murders and crimes. If anyone was untouchable, it was T-Mac. Jesse was eventually taken from me and placed in the custody of the state. I lost contact with him and all of my other kids. I was sad at first, but then I understood that it was best for my kids not to be around me. It took me many years to eventually regret what I did to Jesse. Out of all my kids, I treated him the worst. I went out of my way to do horrible things to him, because that poor boy never had a chance to be seen by me as anything other than T-Mac's son. He never got the benefit of a loving mother. As I got off the drugs, I started to see my father less and less. His look of shame and disappointment would disappear, and I was left with the emptiness of all that I had done and what I had endured. After years of being sober, I started to have seizures. I eventually lost feeling in my legs and my ability to walk. I was confined to a wheelchair. While sitting in that wheelchair, I remember crying for no reason. I would cry every time I thought of Jesse. It took me years to understand that I had become Jesse's T-Mac. The demon that T-Mac had been to me, I became that very same demon to my son. Even to this day, it feels strange to call that boy, well, a man now, my son. I spent so much of my life hating and trying to kill that boy that I think my mind shuts down when I think of him as my son. Because how could any mother do such a thing to their child? When I thought I was healed enough to try and talk to Jesse, for my selfish need to not be such a monster and talk to him, it would always fall apart, because eventually the conversation would come back to what I did to him and his father. I was not ready to have that conversation. When I would see Jesse's face furrow in anger, I saw T-Mac again in him. Jesse looks so much like him, it's scary. I would shut down and call the police. I would lie and say a black man was threatening me. Of course, the police would believe me. I could pass as white, and I was disabled. Jesse, despite his lighter skin tone, was still an obvious black man. I would smile as I would watch Jesse cry as those white cops restrained him for no reason and place him under arrest. I would envision that it was T-Mac they were arresting. Jesse would cry as he stared at me from the back of the police car. He was not crying because he was arrested. His heart was breaking again. I was his abuser and his mother. He was torn between loving and hating me. He wanted a relationship with me, but I knew he hated me. I remember I invited him to spend the night. The way he would look at me sometimes, I could see he wanted to murder me. I was so afraid of him that I would lock my room door at night. I don't think I would ever be ready to have a relationship with my son. But like a hoe who needed the love of her pimp, my son needed my love. He needed me to say I was sorry for what I did to him. He wanted to live in the fantasy world of me being a loving mother to him, and I could never do that. So I had to block him and move on with my life. I knew I would hurt him again. I would destroy the life he's building with his wife and kids. It took me years to understand that he is not T-Mac, and the sins of the father should not be forced upon the son. But then again, Jesse was a child made from rape. He was a child I never wanted, and I was forced to have for my rapist.
I sat in the chair and trembled. It was always hard recounting my mother's story. I didn't want the therapist to see me cry. I was strong and I was healed. I could not destroy that image by crying in front of her. I took a deep shuddering breath. "I need a moment," I said. The therapist took a sip of her coffee and nodded. She seemed absorbed in what I had just told her, too absorbed to speak. I remembered years ago when my mother told me her side of the story. I am not sure how much of it was true. Her mind was already gone. Those conversations with her had broken me. I don't know how I held in all of that pain as I listened to her explain why she hated me and how she never wanted me. Afterwards, I would seek the loving arms of my wife and sob. She was my demon, my monster under my bed. When she died, a very small part of me was sad. The rest rejoiced. She had become to me what T-Mac was to her. I don't think she ever realized that. I walked to the bathroom and splashed water on my face. My hands shook as I stared at my tired reflection in the mirror. I was not finished here. I still had to relive the horrors of living with my mother. I sighed and walked back into the therapist's office and sat down in front of her. The therapist looked up and smiled at me.
"Shall we continue?"
she asked. I took a deep breath and began.
"I woke late again in the night, my body drenched in sweat, my head spinning. I was cold and shaking even though it was almost 90 degrees in the bedroom. I turned to see my older sister Maya laying next to me. She was almost 3 years older than me. I was 6 years old. I was tall, bony, and had a head full of nappy hair. I always felt strange when I was around my siblings. I was the only one that was black. If you looked at me and then at them, you would not believe that we were related at all. Beside Maya lay Sandra, and beside her was my little brother Issa. He was the baby of the family. He was a year old. We all had different fathers except Sandra and Issa. My mother was Egyptian and very poor. I guess it made sense that we all had different fathers because my mother was a prostitute. I got out of bed slowly. I did not want to wake the baby and get hit by my mother again. My lip was still swollen from the last time she had punched me in the mouth for waking him. I was very dizzy. I had overheard the doctors telling my mother that I would feel this way for a long time. It was due to the abundance of crack that was in my system when I was born. I stopped at the door to the bedroom. I heard voices in the living room. My heart started racing. Whenever my mom had company over, something bad normally happened. I could smell the smoke from the pipe she smoked. I did not know what to do. Last time they took my sister Maya to the other room and she screamed so bad I thought she was dying. When she finally stopped screaming, I cried, for I swore my big sister was dead. I waited until after my mother and the men left and went into the room that my big sister was in. I saw her resting on the floor, naked, her pale face bruised and beaten. Her body lay twisted on the carpet. I went up to her. I was afraid to touch her. I noticed she had a lot of blood coming from between her legs.
"Hey Maya, you're peeing blood,"
I said timidly. She did not move. So, I grabbed a blanket that was in the room and covered her with it. I lay next to her and took her hand.
"Don't worry, big sis. I promise I won't tell anyone about this,"
I whispered to her. That was 2 weeks ago. My mother had left with the men that day and did not come back for several days. I had to do what I normally did and try to take care of my family. Maya was still hurt and not moving, so I changed diapers and ran to the local Circle K to steal some bread so we could eat something. My mom did this often. She would leave us for days and we were left to fend for ourselves. I liked it better when she was gone. We never got hurt when she was not there. The men with my mom laughed loudly. I cracked open the door and almost gagged. The smell from whatever they were smoking was horrible. My mother sat with 2 white men. They had a camera they were playing with. I was debating myself on whether I should try and sneak to the bathroom or just get back in bed and pray I did not wet myself while I slept.
Hey, is that your little black son?
One of the men said, pointing at me. My mom looked at me and laughed.
Yeah, he looks like his monkey-ass father.
My mother replied. She looked me in my eyes and seemed like she wanted to cry.
Get your ass back in the bed before I mess you up.
She shouted at me. I did not know why she looked so sad. Her white friend that first noticed me stood up.
He looks nothing like you, Sky. You sure this bastard is yours?
He asked as he walked over to me. I didn't want him to see Maya and the others in the room, so I stepped out and closed the door behind me. He kneeled in front of me. He smelled horrible. His blue eyes looked at me intently.
I always thought Negroes were kind of sexy,
he said, and ran his burnt fingertips down my cheek.
Just leave him alone, Tom,
my mom said. Her voice was shaking. I knew she was scared.
Shut up, Sky, and grab the camera,
Tom shouted at her. My mom stood, camera in hand.
You don't want people to call you a black lover, do you?
My mom said and pointed the camera at me.
They call you one and you do just fine,
Tom replied and started to unzip my sleeper. I looked at my mom, who was still recording me.
Just do as he says, Jesse. Maybe he will buy you the bike you wanted,
Mom said.
Yeah, do as your ma tells you, Jesse. Your sister got a nice new dress and some shoes for her services. I'll get you a bike,
Tom said. I looked Tom in the eye.
Why did you hurt Maya?
I shouted at him. I was angry. I felt like I was going to explode. Tom punched me in the face so hard I fell against the door. I was fighting to stay conscious. I felt myself being picked up and carried to the other room. Tom threw me on the floor. I landed so hard it knocked the wind out of me. The rest of my sleeper was ripped off. I was naked and felt weak from his punch still. I saw him taking off his pants.
You recording this, Sky?
Tom asked. My mom's eyes met mine and she shook her head. Tom reached for me and I kicked him as hard as I could in the stomach. He cursed loudly and hit me several more times. I blacked out and I don't know for how long. I just remember having a lot of pain in my butt and hearing my sister's voice in my ear.
Don't worry, little brother. I won't tell anyone about this,
Maya said. Things went on like this for a while. That was not the last time I saw Tom, nor was it the last time he raped me and my sister. Sometimes it was other men, as my mother recorded. I have to believe that each time she sold us to these men, she died a little inside. Sometimes she would just stare at me. Her thin, pale hand rested on my unkept and unwashed hair. She would rock back and forth, her eyes haunted. For a long time, she was no more than a hollow husk. A jinn, an invisible spirit in Islam, stuck in the ravaged body that was once my mother. I can't say I have many fond memories of her. The bad ones stand out so much more than any good ones we might have shared. Yet to this day, as a grown man with children of my own, I find myself thinking about her. I still weep for her. The little boy in me who sought her arms when I got hurt still yearned for her embrace. Those same arms that would make the world melt with its warmth have also brought me so much pain. Forgive me. My memories of this time are scattered a bit. I have endured so much pain that some horrible memories I have forgotten because other nightmarish times took their place. This brings me to my next memory. My mother and I have one thing in common today. We both hate and fear police. I remember waking up to my mother frantically shaking me.
Jesse, get up! Hurry!
She said, fear in her voice. I sat up quickly, my head spinning. I threw up everywhere. The night before, my mother was shooting up something alone. I had come to sadly look forward to her doing this. I knew she would be out for hours. We would be safe. She would not hit us or force us to do things to each other. My mother heard me wake up and called me in the room to sit with her as she shot up. I did as she asked. I knew she was going to try and touch me as she normally did. She would often call me her big black man as she fondled me. I no longer tried to resist her or when Tom came over with her. I knew they would just beat me until I passed out. I had been beat so many times that even those did not faze me much anymore. I had become the shield for my older sister. When my mother and her Johns wanted Maya, I would attack one of them and get them to focus on me, the little nigger boy that they loved to degrade and destroy. This night, my mother was shaking more than usual.
Do you hate me, Jesse?
She asked as she examined my bruised and dirty face. Some moments there seemed to need clarity, as if my mother was trapped somewhere deep down in that body that some jinn inhabited. Like she was able to escape the monster and look at me sadly. My heart at this point was bruised worse than my face or body could ever be. The heart, unlike the body, starts to get cold and hardens when pain becomes the norm. My heart was ice. It seemed whatever demon had my mother in its grasp was starting to have me as well. "No, Mother," I replied, my voice as emotionless as a corpse.
I am so sorry, my baby boy.
She wept and pulled me closer to her.
I know I have done.
She paused a moment and just stared off as if she was remembering all the things she had done to us.
Bad things.
She paused again, her breath coming in rapid.